6, Part 3. Now we're going to focus in on inequality. And inequality, it gets a lot of attention globally, locally, regionally, right? And the idea of inequality, what does it mean? I mean, you can go back to kindergarten or preschool to think about inequality. This person is getting this toy and I'm not, or this person got 3 pieces of candy and I got 2. So, what are we thinking about in terms of the received economic wisdom? Right? So, you got unequal outcomes, unequal incomes, wages, and you have unequal opportunities, whether it's access to capital, education, health, structural, or do you have both? And unequal outcomes really is about saying that everyone should get the same output, but that can't be unconditional. I mean, this is the idea that um, you work hard and I don't. We get $100, we split it 50-50. Well, that didn't seem fair to you, given you did 90% of the work, right? So, inequality in that sense might be fair because you did 90% of the work, you should get 90 and I should get 10, right? And people will reject insultingly low offers. I mean, if we worked 50-50 and you got 90 and 10, then I would think that would be unequal and that wouldn't be fair. And so inequality and fairness and poverty, they're all tied in together because if the rich get richer and the poor get richer, but the rich get richer by more than the poor get richer, is that unfair? Is that unequal? I mean, it is unequal because we've increased the gap between rich and poor. But since the poor also got richer, shouldn't we be happy with that? That one's harder. Um, Equal opportunities, I think, is easier in the sense of trying to give everyone the same chance give everyone the same starting position to go from. And you say, well, what? Of course, we all agree with that, but that's not always the same either. If you think about structural bias, you think about discrimination, you think about gender discrimination, you think about racial discrimination, you think about um, sexual preference discrimination, right? I mean, if you think about all these different ways that people are discriminated against, do they really have equal opportunity? So, wow, this is where economics is important at the same time, economics can get into a lot of trouble because we don't have any moral authority over what is fair and what's not fair. We can define what's equal and what's unequal, or we can define inequality. But it all comes down to the political choice of whether or not some inequality is fair or not, right? Bill Gates is a billionaire because he came up with Microsoft and Word and Windows and all that business. And I'm not. Uh, is that fair? I think so. He had a good idea and he pulled it off. Um, do I think it's fair he pays a smaller percentage in taxes than me? Yeah, I don't think that's fair. I think if you win the lottery, you can pay things back. But that's me personally, right? And everyone can differ on that. A lot of people don't want to pay any taxes at all. It's my income. I earned it. I just want to keep it. Other people are more than willing to pay taxes as the price to live in a civilized society, as the saying goes. So we'll buzz through this, but I'm telling you, this is a minefield. But economics jumps right in the middle of it. Okay, inequality of outcomes. We talked about that. Um, and here's the key: the way economists have thought about this problem for a long time is that economic theory says don't worry about inequality because the market will correct the problem itself. It's self-correcting. So this is Simon Kuznets, who back in the 50s, he came up with this hypothesis that as an economy grows richer, inequality first increases, but then actually decreases. Sorry for the typo there. It's an inverted U. So this is the Kuznets curve. So on the horizontal, we got economic development, which is per capita GDP. And on the horizontal, on the vertical, we have income inequality as measured in the gap between the rich and the poor. And this curve says that capitalism and market economies are self correcting. At first, the inequality increases and then it self corrects. And this curve is very simple, but a very powerful idea that capitalism is not the problem, right? The poor get poorer and the rich get richer. But at some point, the rich get richer and the poor get richer because the rich get rich enough to change the rules so that the poor can get richer as well. Okay? So the Kuznets curve is a big idea, and especially if you're a capitalist, this defends your assumption to just leave the market alone. We don't need intervention to solve this problem. Okay, so why does inequality first increase? So when you first start developing an economy, money goes to those who have the capital to invest, and money goes to those who have the best innovations, right? And also, there's rural labor force is moving into the city looking for jobs. And given that the supply of labor has gone up, the wage goes down. So now the rich are getting richer and the poor are getting poorer because you've got pressure on wages because you got so many folks from the rural area moving into the urban area. All right, then why does inequality then decrease? Well, at some point, when you've matured in your economy and you've reached industrialization and democratization and the welfare state takes hold where you've got taxation and redistribution of income, there's going to be this trickle down effect in which per capita income increases. Per capita income increases for the poor, which effectively decreases economic inequality. So the good news is capitalism, it works. We don't need a bunch of government intervention. I mean, it will emerge. The governments will help create healthcare and education and this and that. But we don't need to fret, I guess is the point. Is it a happy ending? Well, I mean, yes and no. Let's take a look at the data. So relative inequality since 1990. You've got total global inequality, looks like it's falling. You've got inequality between countries, looks like it's falling. Inequality within a country is actually sort of trending up a little bit, right? So rising inequality within many countries, not them all, but the US, China, India, we have been seeing the rich get richer and the poor get richer, but not by as much as the rich get richer, right? So for Malaysia, you look at falling poverty. So even though the rich are getting richer by more than the poor get rich, the poor are getting rich enough to decrease the level of poverty. And so what's there to complain about? So what if the rich are getting richer and the poor are getting richer? As long as they're getting above the poverty line, then we've got really nothing to complain about. That's what the economists would say. And it's hard to argue with that, right? The poor are getting rich enough to not be in extreme poverty anymore. Economic growth typically comes with lower absolute poverty rates. And that's the key, absolute poverty rates. All right, here's a country, Malaysia, by different ethnicities. And you can see that the poverty rate over time is falling. That should be, cause for success. I mean, so what if the inequality is going up if the poverty rate is going down? Sorry about that. My dog was just chewing on her squeaky toy. Here in Malaysia, it looks like inequality is also falling slightly. Now, the fall in absolute poverty is due to growth, and the falling inequality helped, but you got to separate the two out. Poverty rates are falling, but at the same time, inequality is growing. Now, poverty rates could fall by more if we were to share the wealth, but we don't have to. That's kind of the point. You're separating them out. We don't have to share the wealth. All right, so how do we measure inequality? Well, the Gini coefficient is the key measure, and it's one way to measure economic inequality. All right, how do we do it? 3 steps. We plot a baseline of equal distribution of wealth. We then plot the actual distribution, which is called the Lorenz curve, and then we calculate the Gini coefficient. So as you can see here, we have a baseline of equal income. So that essentially represents a cumulative distribution function of a uniform distribution. So if you think about it, what it says is that straight line going from the 2 corners represents equal income. Now, what the Lorenz curve represents is the actual distribution of income. And the way I've drawn it is that there is, as you can see, the share of income here. So if you go along the horizontal axis of income, you can see they get a very small share of total income. And as you go further to the highest income levels, you can see they pick up the biggest chunk. So the more curvature there is on the Lorenz curve, the more inequality there is. And so the Gini coefficient then is just a way to calculate, relative to that baseline, how unequal things are. Right? So if the Gini coefficient is closer to 0, it means minimal income inequality. Closer to 1, it means maximum income inequality. In other words, the top 1% has all the resources. Here's some examples of the Gini coefficient from a few years back. South Africa, very unequal. Brazil, very unequal. China, surprisingly, for a communist country. You would think share and share alike, but no, very unequal. The United States is right there. Britain, Egypt. Sweden is one of the more egalitarian societies. Their Gini coefficient, there's still income inequality, but it's significantly less than, say, South Africa. What it looks like around the globe, it's a little hard to read, but the more yellow, the smaller the Gini coefficient, the darker, the larger. You can see Sweden is very light, South Africa is very dark. The US is pretty dark, Canada is pretty light, Australia is pretty light. A lot of Europe has lower Gini coefficients. Here's another ranking of different countries. You can see the Scandinavian, Nordic countries, Iceland, Norway, Denmark, Finland are all over on the left-hand side. You can see Chile, Mexico, the United States, Turkey, they're all over on the right-hand side. And so I have to kind of decide what sort of society do you want to live in, right? I mean, a winner-take-all society or a winner pays more taxes society so that you can redistribute the wealth. And these countries have made decisions. And if you're really into um, changing the inequality in the United States, you can either do it by supporting progressive candidates, or you give up and you move to Norway. Okay, but some of this economic wisdom is a little out of step. There are three things that are missing, right? So when we think about this, is absolute inequality matters, the poorest matter, and relative income matters. So the idea of keeping up with the Joneses does matter to people. And absolute inequality does matter. So if the poor get richer and the rich get richer by more, that still matters to people. That just doesn't seem fair. So there's a wake up call to economists to think about absolute inequality and to care about the extremes that we always hear on TV. Well, look at this, the top 1% has 90% of the assets, or the top 1% of 1% has 80% of all the assets. That shouldn't be fair, you know. Or you go to France and you look at Versailles, the palace, and you think, well, that really isn't fair to spend all that money on a palace when people are starving. Well, yeah, you end up with a revolution, right? The Russian Revolution, thinking about the czars and all the palaces they had and the peasants, and you end up with a revolution. I mean, people care about these extremes and they care about absolute inequality. And if you push this inequality too far, you will have a civil war, or you will have a revolution. You will have an actual people got nothing to lose, and so that's what happens. All right, so absolute versus relative inequality. So you look at down in the middle there, state A. Suppose there are three people and they get 1, 2, and 3, versus state B, they get 2, 4, and 6. Now, when you interview students, over half say B has higher inequality. But the Gini index would say they're exactly the same because, right, in a relative sense, 2 is just double 1, 3, 6 is just double 2, 3, and they're really not all that different, right? In a relative sense, everybody is the inequality hasn't changed. But when you look at the difference between 3 and 1 and 6 and 2, obviously 4 is bigger than 2, and people have a visceral reaction to that difference. They're like, well, that's less fair than the 4 difference is less fair than having a 2 difference, even though relatively speaking it really doesn't matter, right? And so this debate between the absolutists and the relativists really depends on where you come down on this. We all got richer. You got 2, I got 6. You doubled your income, I doubled my income. What's wrong with that? Well, but now the gap is 4, and you don't like that. Well, for me, I'm twice as happy, and you're twice as happy. So what's the difference, right? So when this absolute Gini coefficient is greater, shows more inequality, people react. All right, so this is just looking at different data for all this business. So you can read about the dilemma here for absolutists. The important aspect of inequality are the poorest being left behind, right? We talked about this again, right? That the poor, we're viewing the poor as a public bad, and how far left behind are the poor when the rich get richer? So if you counting poor people may miss what's happening to the poorest. So in other words, if the floor stays put, now there's poor people being left behind. But if the poverty line or the floor actually increases with the same amount of poverty, we haven't left anybody behind, or not as many people behind, because we have increased their standard of living. So they're still poor relative to the rich, but they're not poor anymore because they've crossed a threshold. Okay. So relative income matters to perceptions of poverty. Poverty is absolute in the space of welfare. What do we mean by that? All right. Poverty measures use this constant realign, poverty measures that use a constant realign don't account for the concerns that people face in terms of relative deprivation and social exclusion. Right? So the absolute approach in the space of capabilities translates into a relative approach in the space of commodities. So what are we talking about here? We're trying to say that if you're looking at everything in absolute terms, you can't compare them to people who are looking at them in relative terms. So economists spend most of their whole career learning to think about things in relative terms. Relative prices. This is expensive relative to that. This income is rich relative to this, right? And when you start thinking about things in absolute, then it becomes economists don't deal with it that way, because when you think about it in absolute, then your baseline is not the next best alternative, which we talked about in terms of opportunity cost and all that, right? So relative income matters. That's the point. So how can we do better? Well, should we care about inequality and relative poverty? And should we have greater success to try to deal with inequality? Well, if there are structural biases so that there's discrimination, absolutely. We need to deal with what you could call fake inequality. These are structural biases that do not give everyone the same opportunity. That needs to be addressed. And once everybody has the same opportunity and you end up with winners and losers, and the winners, in theory, could compensate the losers, we're all better off. Should we do something then when dealing with the rich getting richer and more rich than the poor get richer? Well, again, that's going to boil down to the preferences of your population. In the United States, there's big, strong pressure not to pay taxes to redistribute income. In Scandinavian countries, there is pressure to redistribute wealth. And both views are legit. Where do you want to be? It's going to depend on your preferences. Do you think that what you earn, you deserve, and you don't need to offer a helping hand? Or you're going to offer a helping hand through the church, or you're going to offer a helping hand through different NGOs? Or do you think that the state can act as an arbitrage mechanism to help the poor? You give your money into taxes. So I'll give you an example. Walking around Stockholm, Sweden, with my wife, and she's Swedish, and there are people, homeless people, or people who are on the street begging for money, and nobody's giving them anything. Nobody's throwing anything in the cup. And I thought Swedes were very generous and always were trying to help. And her reaction was, well, no, the state takes care of this. We're not going to throw in money into someone who's, asking for money on the street, because the state solves this problem. And so in her mind, the idea of private donations made less sense, because the problem was already solved through the state. Whereas in the US, if you're walking through New York City or Denver or wherever, this is private donations more than state intervention. Even if there is state in some level of state intervention, it's nothing like the Nordic countries. All right, so you can read all this. So back to where we started: economic growth and poverty and inequality. Right? We push for economic growth as a way to make the pie bigger. And how we then share in that economic growth is going to depend on the preferences of the population. We can either try to eliminate all forms of discrimination so that we have equal opportunity. There should not be any inequalities in opportunity, whether, again, as I say, by gender, by race, by creed, by religion, by sexual orientation, you name the potential bias, those should all be eliminated. Most every economist is going to agree with that. Now, once all those structural things are eliminated, do we have a winner-take-all society, or do we have a winner shares progressive society? Well, that really is going to depend on you. Right? I mean, that's going to depend on your vote here in November. Bernie Sanders is the most progressive of the candidates who is running for president, with an idea of free college and free redistribution. But, you say, well, in Wyoming, we're a very conservative place. And I say, yeah, that's true. But we do have the Hathaway Scholarship, which is essentially tax dollars funding college education. So if you get relatively good grades here in Wyoming, you can go to the University of Wyoming pretty inexpensively. Is that conservatism? Is that free marketism? Well, no, that's pretty socialist policy. Socialist for our own state. So it becomes kind of tricky when it comes to the sharing rule. You can be very, very progressive, and you can be very pro-conservative, and you can end up not having it black or white. It ends up being gray. Conservatives have socialist policies. Progressives have market policies. But I think the one thing we can agree on is that we may not have equal outcomes, but we should have equal opportunities to get to those outcomes.